believe in forgiving or forgetting?
Let's toast to our golden girl, my dad said, raising his glass high like he was delivering the climax of some heartfelt movie speech, the kind with swelling music and proud smiles. His voice cut through the soft clinking of silverware and the awkward silence I'd been swimming in since I walked through the front door. He was smiling at Emma, of course, not at me. Never at me. She looked up with that perfect, tight-lipped smile she'd been rehearsing since she was 12, the smile that said, "I'm the favorite and I know it, but I'll pretend I don't see it." I didn't raise my glass. I didn't say a word. I stood up, gathered the dirty plates like some ghostly waitress who just happened to live in the background of her own family, and walked straight into the kitchen. I didn't make a scene. God, I never did. That's the part people always get wrong when they ask why I left, or what happened between me and Emma. They imagine yelling, some wild confrontation, tears, maybe even plates thrown across the room like a bad Lifetime movie. But no. I just scraped leftover chicken into the trash, stacked the forks into the dishwasher, wiped a fingerprint off the counter, and walked out the back door. Quiet. Controlled. Forgettable. Just the way they raised me. That dinner was supposed to be a celebration for Emma's new tenure. Professor Emma Gray, Mom had said 3 times in one breath on the phone a week ago, like she was trying to convince the universe, or maybe just herself, that this title meant something cosmic. I hadn't even been planning to come, but then she added, "You haven't seen your father in over 6 months. He misses you, you know." He didn't. But I came anyway, because I always do. And from the moment I stepped into that house, I could feel it in the air, something hollow and rehearsed, like the furniture had all been moved slightly to make the evening seem warmer than it actually was. Mom had laid out the expensive dishes, the ones she only used when guests came over, even though it was just us. The roast was overcooked, but she kept saying, "It's just how your father likes it," like that was a badge of honor. Emma walked in 5 minutes late, kissed Dad on the cheek, complimented Mom's apron, and sat down like she was returning to a throne. I tried. I swear to God, I really did try. I asked Emma about her classes, her students, even the boring policy meetings I knew she loved to complain about. She answered politely but vaguely, like she couldn't be bothered to waste real sentences on someone like me. Dad laughed a little too hard at her joke about kids these days, and Mom kept looking over at me like I was a guest who'd stayed too long. Then the toast happened. It wasn't just the words. It was how he said them. The way he looked at her, like nothing in the world had ever disappointed him as long as she was still shining. His voice was full of this nostalgic pride I hadn't heard since, well, never, if I'm being honest. I looked at my hands in my lap and realized they were clenched into fists, my nails digging crescents into my palms. And when I glanced up and saw Emma looking back at me, not cruelly, just smug, I knew I had to leave. Not just the table. The whole thing. So I stood up. I picked up the dishes, because that's what I do, I clean up. I fix things. I remove the evidence. I walked out the back door, got in my car, and drove in silence. The kind of silence that doesn't fill the space, but wraps around you like a noose. It was almost midnight when my phone lit up with a text from Emma. The screen glowed like an accusation in the dark. "I don't know what you did, but Mom's a wreck." I read it twice. I didn't respond. Because here's the thing. I hadn't done anything. Not yet. But she was right to be afraid. The thing about families is that they rarely fall apart all at once. More often, they splinter slowly over years, sometimes decades, the cracks deepening in silence until one day someone finally points out that the floorboards are rotted and the walls are leaning. And by then it's already too late to save the house. I used to believe that the worst thing a parent could do is scream or hit or threaten, but I've come to understand that the deepest damage is done quietly, through favoritism disguised as concern, through love handed out like ration soup, more to one, less to another. Depending on the day, the mood, the story being told at the dinner table. Emma had always been the son in our household, the golden child whose every mistake was rebranded as a learning experience, whose failures were softened with excuses and reshaped into charming anecdotes that Mom would repeat to her book club or Dad would chuckle about over the phone to old army buddies. I, on the other hand, was the planner, the helper, the one who stayed late to clean up, who sat quietly through Emma's recitals and spelling bees and student council campaigns, who learned early on that asking for attention was more exhausting than earning it. And no matter how many times I tried to shine, my light was always somehow too dim, too cold, or too inconvenient to matter. I remember one afternoon, clear as crystal, still sharp at the edges, when I was 12 and Emma was 10, and we'd come home from school to find Mom sitting on the couch with her eyes red and a damp tissue crumpled in her hand. She looked up at me like I had already disappointed her and said, in a voice heavy with accusation, "Your sister's in trouble at school." Again. Emma stood beside her, head bowed, the picture of pitiful remorse. The story spilled out in pieces. Emma had cheated on a quiz, or maybe borrowed someone else's homework. The details never quite matched, but somehow, within 10 minutes, the entire situation turned into a conversation about how much pressure Emma was under and how I, being older and supposedly wiser, should have helped her study. I took the grounding without protest. I gave up my weekend plans. And Emma got ice cream and a new set of gel pens. That was the first time I noticed it, the way guilt could be redirected like a magician's trick, how Mom could twist responsibility with a sigh and a sad look until you no longer remembered what actually happened. I didn't call it manipulation back then. I just called it home. There were dozens of moments like that, scattered through our lives like landmines, easy to forget until you stepped on one again. The time Emma crashed Dad's car and blamed it on a weird noise I supposedly ignored when I borrowed it the week before. The time she missed curfew and said I told her it was fine. The year she applied to college late and Mom spent 3 sleepless nights calling every admissions office in a 100-mile radius, then cried in the kitchen when Emma finally got in, cried from relief, not gratitude. Because no one ever thanked me for proofreading Emma's essays or filling out her FAFSA or registering her for orientation when she forgot. And the funny part, if there's anything remotely funny in all of this, is that I wasn't bitter back then. Not really. I believed that loyalty would eventually be rewarded, that if I just kept showing up, if I kept playing the part of the responsible one, someone would eventually notice. Someone would pull me aside, maybe Dad, maybe Mom, and say, "I know you've carried a lot, and we're grateful." But that never came. Instead, the roles hardened, like clay left in the sun. Emma was the charming, chaotic dreamer. I was the steady, dependable shadow. And once a family decides who you are, it takes a damn miracle to change their minds. Even after I moved out, first to a dorm room that felt like freedom, then to a 1-bedroom apartment that smelled like possibility, I kept coming back. Holidays, birthdays, anniversaries. Not because I wanted to, but because the guilt was ingrained, passed down like family recipes and genetic flaws. I smiled through toasts. I brought wine. I held my tongue every time someone praised Emma's latest achievement like she'd invented fire. I listened as she told stories that I knew weren't true, that painted her in glowing colors while reducing me to a helpful footnote. But the dinner last week, the Golden Girl toast, was different. Not just because of the words, but because of how casually they were spoken, as if everyone had finally stopped pretending there was any balance left to preserve. My father, who had barely acknowledged me when I arrived, lifted his glass with that familiar smirk and said it like it was obvious, like it had always been true. She was the golden one. She was the reason we gathered. She was worth celebrating. And the worst part? Emma didn't even look surprised. After I left, after I drove aimlessly for 40 minutes and sat in the parking lot of an abandoned gas station with the windows rolled down, listening to the ticking of my engine cooling off, I thought about what would happen next. I thought about Mom crying, about Emma calling me dramatic, about Dad pretending not to understand what I was upset about. And I realized something I hadn't fully admitted to myself until that moment. My silence was the only thing holding their version of the story together. They had built this family on a foundation of selective memory and quiet complicity. They relied on me to absorb the guilt, to carry the emotional weight so that Emma could keep floating and Mom could keep denying and Dad could keep drinking and smiling and pretending that nothing was wrong. But I was tired. Not the kind of tired you fix with a nap, but the kind that seeps into your bones and makes you start wondering what your life might have been like if someone had just once looked you in the eye and said, "I see you." That night, after Emma's text, I didn't respond. But I did open a box from the back of my closet, one I hadn't touched in years. Inside were fragments, letters, notes, a printed-out thesis with my handwriting in the margins, a USB stick labeled "Insurance," and a photo of the four of us, smiling on a beach trip that I remember as a complete disaster. I held that photo for a long time, staring at the way my younger self stood slightly to the side, not quite touching the others, her expression just a bit too practiced. They say memory is unreliable, but pain has a way of clarifying the past in brutal detail. And for the first time in a long while, I didn't feel powerless. I felt awake. And maybe, just maybe, it was time for someone else to carry the weight. It's a strange thing, the kind of calm that settles in when you finally let go of the fantasy that someone will apologize to you, when you stop waiting for the day your mother will look you in the eye and admit she was wrong, or for your sister to take responsibility for all the ways she used you like scaffolding she climbed just to knock down the ladder once she reached the top. That calm, cold, and almost clinical wrapped itself around me like armor the night I slipped back into the house, a house that had never felt like home, but always smelled the same old wood polish, overcooked meat, and lavender air freshener sprayed in all the wrong rooms. I knew the key code hadn't changed, because of course it hadn't, because Emma was the kind of person who believed that the world would always revolve around her, and that locks were for other people's problems. The porch light was off, but the living room lamp had been left glowing, casting soft shadows across the beige carpet, that same ugly pattern Mom had picked out years ago and insisted on keeping because it hid stains well. I walked through that front hallway with the quiet steps of someone who knows exactly where not to creak the floorboards, who remembers where the third stair groans and where the tile in the kitchen shifts just enough to betray you if you put your full weight on it. They were upstairs, all of them, probably asleep or pretending to be, unaware that the version of me they'd all depended on, reliable, patient, quiet, had started to crack like the porcelain swan figurines in Mom's curio cabinet. I didn't come to scream. I didn't come to throw things or make declarations. I came to rearrange something so small that no one would notice it at first, something subtle but meaningful, like loosening a single bolt in a machine that wouldn't break immediately but would start to whine, falter, and then finally collapse under the weight of its own dysfunction. In the dining room, where the remnants of the dinner still sat untouched, Emma's wine glass half full, a crusted spoon resting on the side of the gravy dish, I paused just long enough to breathe in the leftover tension. Then I turned toward the glass cabinet in the hallway, the one Mom had dubbed the memory case, where she kept trophies, certificates, and photos in delicate gold frames, curated not by merit, but by narrative. Emma's graduation cap rested on a velvet platform. Her Student of the Month plaque from sophomore year was centered just below it. There, near the bottom, sat the one item I'd come for, a small, plastic trophy, cheap and unimpressive, with a gold plate that read "First Place, Regional Debate, Emma Gray." It had been mine. I remember that day not because of the win, but because of what came after. Emma had been caught skipping school 2 weeks earlier, and Mom was on the verge of some kind of breakdown, her voice raw from yelling, her pride bruised from the calls home. I had offered the trophy up like some kind of peace offering, suggesting, quietly, that no one outside the school would know who had really earned it. Emma could take the picture, and I'd stay out of the frame, and maybe then things would settle down. I told myself I was helping. What I was really doing was disappearing. I took the trophy, unscrewed the little gold plate with the nail file I'd brought for exactly that purpose, and tucked the plate into my coat pocket. The trophy itself I left in the kitchen sink, burned slightly at the base, the smell of melted plastic faint but undeniable. Beside it, on the fogged-up bathroom mirror, I wrote a sentence with my fingertip, just visible enough to emerge once the steam returned. Tell her who really helped you cheat. I didn't wait for anyone to wake up. I didn't linger to see the reactions or hear the aftermath. I locked the door behind me and walked down the driveway like someone who had just taken out the trash. The next morning, I didn't check my phone right away, though I knew messages would come. I brewed coffee in my tiny apartment, which smelled like freedom and dusty books, sat cross-legged on the worn leather couch, and watched the sun rise through the crooked blinds. It wasn't until almost 10 that I finally picked up my phone and scrolled through the notifications. 10 missed calls from Mom. 3 from Emma. One message stood out, not for what it said, but for the fact that it was short, rushed, and clearly typed with trembling fingers. "You better not have kept that file." And there it was. Proof. Confirmation that she remembered. That she knew exactly what I still had, what I had never thrown away, despite all the times I'd told myself to let it go. The file. The one thing that could dismantle the Golden Girl myth and expose everything beneath it as a carefully curated lie. 15 years ago, under pressure from both my mother and a panicking Emma, I had written my sister's graduate thesis. Not helped with. Not proofread. I had written the entire thing, front to back, over the course of a month filled with caffeine-fueled nights and whispered phone calls where Emma begged and Mom reassured me that it was just this once and for the family's sake. They had promised it would never be used. That it was just a placeholder. But the day Emma submitted it under her name and walked across that stage in her cap and gown, Mom squeezed my hand and said, "This is our victory." I remember nodding. I remember smiling. I remember swallowing something bitter that still hasn't gone down. And I kept the file. Not to blackmail. Not even because I thought I'd need it. I kept it because throwing it away would have been the final erasure, the ultimate acceptance that my work, my effort, my brilliance, never belonged to me in that house. Now, as I read Emma's text, I realized something new. Not only had she never apologized, she had lived every day since assuming I had either deleted the file or was too weak to ever use it. She had built her career on the assumption that I would continue to be silent. That assumption, more than anything, made me laugh. Not loudly, not cruelly, but deeply. Because silence is only noble when it's a choice. And I was done being quiet. There's a particular heaviness that settles over you when you open a folder you haven't touched in over a decade, one that hasn't been updated, moved, or renamed, yet somehow feels alive, pulsing with the quiet knowledge that it contains something both dangerous and sacred, something so honest that once it's seen, it can never be unseen again. That night, after Emma's warning text had burrowed into the back of my mind like a worm chewing through rotten wood, I sat at my kitchen table with the laptop I'd kept since grad school, its surface scratched and warm from too many nights left on, its keys faintly oily from years of overuse, and I hovered the cursor over a folder labeled simply and without ceremony, drafts. I didn't need to open it to remember what was inside. I could see it all, even with the lid still closed, the way some people remember the last words of someone who's gone, not just the words themselves, but the cadence, the weight, the temperature of the room when they were spoken. That folder held the only thing I'd ever written that had power, not because it was brilliant or elegant, but because it held the potential to unravel an entire life constructed on a foundation of performance, manipulation, and convenience. Emma's life. Or rather, the version of it she had managed to maintain thanks to a single act of betrayal wrapped in family obligation and sealed with silence. It wasn't just the thesis, although that alone would have been enough to burn everything down if I'd chosen to drop it at the right doorstep. It was the accompanying email I'd written 6 times, in different tones and structures, each more restrained than the last, because if there's one thing I've learned, it's that truth hits harder when you're not shouting it. There were versions that bled rage, full of demands and accusations, but those I always deleted within minutes, because they felt like giving her control over the narrative again. The version that survived, the one I'd saved but never sent, was clinical, cold, almost bureaucratic in tone, a quiet voice in a noisy room, just loud enough to be heard by the right people. I opened it, read it again, line by line, and was struck by how detached it sounded, how far removed I seemed from the events it described. It began with a polite introduction, followed by a brief but damning timeline of how, when, and why the thesis had been written by someone other than the person whose name had been printed on the final page. It referenced the attached files, including drafts annotated with timestamps, notes in my own handwriting, early outlines bearing Emma's name in title only. There was no vitriol, no insults, just facts presented with the kind of precision that makes denial difficult and damage control almost impossible. I'd told myself over the years that keeping it was just insurance, something to hold on to in case things ever got truly unbearable, but now, looking back, I realize I kept it because it was the only proof that I mattered in a family that had spent years convincing me otherwise. That folder was my own quiet rebellion, a reminder that I had been more than just the support beam holding up Emma's carefully constructed tower of illusion. I had been the architect of the very foundation she stood on, and she knew it, had always known it, and had chosen to bury that knowledge beneath a mountain of self-serving revisionism. What Emma didn't understand, what she had never really grasped, was that I had nothing left to lose. People like her, they cling to image like it's air, believing that as long as they're admired, envied, praised, they're safe from consequence. But I had already lived through the worst of it, the invisibility, the quiet dismissals, the backhanded compliments, the family photos where I was always cropped near the edge like an afterthought. I had already mourned the idea of ever being seen, ever being chosen. And when you've already buried that hope, you stop fearing the fallout. As I sat there, rereading my own words, I could feel that old part of me, the one who used to lie awake wondering why she wasn't enough, start to fade, replaced by someone steadier, colder, not cruel but clear. I opened a new tab and typed out a brief email to Emma. No threats. No confessions. Just a line that read, "You were right to be worried. You should be." I didn't send it, not yet. I let it sit there, blinking, waiting, like the slow inhale before a scream you've been holding in for years. It wasn't revenge, not in the way people imagine it, the dramatic confrontation, the ruined reputation, the scandal. What I wanted wasn't for Emma to suffer. It was for her to remember. To remember that every time she stood in front of a classroom, every paper she graded, every speech she gave at faculty dinners about integrity and academic excellence, all of it was perched on a lie. My words, my work, my silence. The next file I opened was the thesis itself. I hadn't looked at it in years, not since the night I uploaded the final version and watched Emma's name replace mine in the header. It was good. Better than I remembered. Not flawless, but strong enough to fool the board, strong enough to win her accolades she didn't earn. And somehow, reading it again didn't make me angry. It made me sad. Sad for the girl I used to be, who thought loyalty meant surrender, who believed that family came before truth, who let herself be talked into giving away something sacred because she wanted her mother to stop crying, her sister to stop failing, her home to feel stable for just a moment. I don't know when I made the decision, not exactly. Maybe it had already been made long ago, the moment Emma decided to text me with a threat instead of an apology, the moment my mother sat across from me at dinner and pretended not to notice that I hadn't touched my wine, hadn't smiled once, hadn't spoken beyond basic pleasantries. Maybe that was the moment I realized that silence had never protected me, it had only protected them. So I clicked forward. Not to the university. Not yet. But to myself. A copy. A backup. A step. And then I sat there, watching the progress bar move, and wondered, not for the first time, what it would feel like to finally stop cleaning up everyone else's messes. To let the truth be its own kind of storm. Not violent, but relentless. Not vengeful, but honest. It wasn't the send button I was afraid of. It was what came after, the silence once the truth had been spoken. The kind of silence that can't be filled with denial or distraction. The kind that forces people to sit with what they've done. Or what they failed to do. And I was ready to let them hear it. There's a silence that comes not from absence, but from tension pulled so tight it hums beneath the surface of everything like a taut wire ready to snap. A silence that doesn't soothe but rattles. And that was the silence I found myself sitting in the next morning as I stared out the window of my apartment, the sky dull and expressionless, the trees outside trembling faintly in the wind like they, too, were holding their breath. I hadn't slept, not really, just dozed off sometime around 4 in the morning with the laptop, still open on the coffee table, the soft blue glow painting shadows across the walls like ghosts pacing in quiet judgment. My phone, which I had silenced the night before, lit up with missed calls, one after another, some from Emma, others from a number I knew by heart even though I hadn't saved it in years, my mother's landline, the one she always insisted on keeping because, in her words, real families don't talk through screens. They were calling not because they missed me, not because they wanted to check on how I was feeling after walking out of dinner without saying goodbye, but because something had been disturbed, something had shifted, and, for the first time, they didn't know if they could control it. The narrative they'd relied on, the version of events they'd shaped and polished and rehearsed for years, had begun to wobble, not because I shouted, not because I accused, but because I let the possibility of exposure hang in the air long enough to be felt. That's the thing about secrets. They're only powerful when you agree to keep them. Emma had texted again sometime around 6 in the morning. It was longer than before, but just as desperate, a tangled mess of concern and threat and that familiar tone she used when she didn't know whether to beg for my mercy or remind me who she believed she was to our family. I don't know what you're trying to do, but if this is about the thesis, you know it was Mom's idea. You know I didn't ask for that. We were kids. It's not fair to bring this up now, not when things are finally going well. Don't do this. You don't have to do this. Please. She'd never said please to me before. Not once. And the strange part, the part that caught me off guard, even after everything, was that I didn't feel satisfied. I didn't feel victorious. I didn't feel like someone who'd won something, because this wasn't a game, and I hadn't wanted her to beg. I had wanted her to see me. Not just now, not just because I held the power to unravel her career, but to really see me, the years I spent quietly holding up her mistakes, the weight I'd carried in silence, while she smiled her way through every opportunity that should have been shared, but never was. But even in her panic, Emma couldn't name what she'd taken. She could only ask me not to take it back. I typed slowly, not out of hesitation, but out of care, because I wanted every word to land without confusion, without room for interpretation or spin. I didn't want revenge. I wanted clarity. I wanted my words to cut not like a knife, but like a mirror, reflecting back everything they'd chosen to ignore. I began the email simply, Emma, I'm not angry. I'm not interested in ruining you. But I'm done pretending this never happened. And then, below it, I added the line that I knew would be the one she remembered for the rest of her life. Attached is something I think you lost. I didn't need to explain what the attachment was. She already knew. Whether she opened it in horror or dread or stubborn denial, she would see her name at the top of a document she hadn't written, with my notes still intact, my voice humming between the lines. It would be like a ghost reaching up from beneath the floorboards, not violent, not loud, just undeniably present. She would know I had kept it. She would know that I had chosen this moment. And most importantly, she would know that this time, I wasn't going to disappear quietly. I sent it. Not to the university, not to the ethics board, not yet. Just to her. I wanted her to sit with it first, to feel the weight of what she'd buried and wrapped in a bow of family loyalty, to see what it looked like when someone you underestimated stood up, not with fists, not with threats, but with the truth. My phone buzzed within minutes, vibrating on the table like something alive and frenzied. First Emma, then Mom. Then silence. Then, unexpectedly, my father. He didn't call. He didn't text. He emailed a short line that said, "You went too far. Your mother is inconsolable." No greeting. No sign-off. Just that. As if I was meant to feel guilt over making someone feel something real for once, as if the tears my mother was now shedding carried more weight than the years she had spent watching me slowly disappear in plain sight without offering so much as a hand. I didn't reply. I didn't answer when Emma called, either, not the first time, not the second, not the 10th. I watched the screen light up with her name, then go dark again and again, until finally, it stopped. The quiet that followed wasn't peaceful, but it was honest, and that made it enough. That evening, as the sky darkened and the city around me turned from restless to still, I opened a blank document and wrote the first line of something new, something real, something entirely mine. Chapter 1. The Girl They Forgot. I didn't know if it would become a book, a memoir, or just another file saved to the desktop, but for the first time in years, I wasn't writing for anyone else's benefit. I wasn't writing to prove I could. I was writing because I no longer needed permission. And as I sat there, my fingers hovering over the keys, I understood something that I had never dared admit before, that the deepest revenge isn't public humiliation or scandal or courtroom drama. It's living without pretending. It's looking at the people who erased you and realizing they can't do it anymore, not because they've changed, but because you have. It's refusing to protect a version of the past that served no one but the ones who broke you. In the end, I didn't expose Emma to the world. I didn't forward the email to the university. I didn't destroy her because destruction was never the point. The point was to remind her and all of them that the silence they depended on was no longer theirs to command. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough. Or maybe, someday soon, I'll hit send again.